Well, it's a huge pleasure to welcome Brenda to give the last talk of the term on transforming energy demand. Most people who go through universities, they study and then they go out into the world and try and apply what they've learned. And Brenda has operated the other way round. First of all, gaining a great deal of experience working in housing, which she then brought into the university and which has informed her work ever since on fuel poverty and on energy efficiency. This combination of experience and rigor and passion is still keeping her going at a phenomenal rate. Some time after retirement. It's very impressive. And I always remember. I always have very good memories of Brenda as the person who encouraged me to do a DPhil and who supervised me through it and who was my boss. She was right at the beginning of the Environmental Change Institute as one of the first research fellows there. She's made an enormous contribution to one of the quiet success stories of the last 30 years in energy, the energy efficiency movement. And she has a body of knowledge on how this gets applied in the real world that is very hard to find matched anywhere. So welcome, Brenda. And I should just say on the technicalities of this, do please feel free to put questions into the chat box, and there will be points along the way where we'll pause and we can put those to Brenda. Thank you. Brenda, over to you.
Well, many thanks, Sarah. I was blushing at this end. Anyway, today what I'm going to do is talk about transforming energy demand. And as you implied, this is based on many years of work that we did at ECI, particularly on European energy policy in relationship to appliances and to housing. And so I'm going to have a thesis for today. And that thesis is that appliance policy has been successful, that housing policy, particularly as applied in the UK, has been less successful. So what are the opportunities for the UK's housing policy to learn from appliance policy? And when I say that the ECI Lower Carbon Futures Group worked on European policy, we did that with a project called Decade for just over a decade, from 1994 onwards. So the information a lot of the information I'm going to give you is very dated, but I don't think the lessons are. So in the blurb about the lecture, it says, do you know whether your electricity demand has reduced or not? Well, the answer is yes, it has. This is the household electricity use in kilowatt hours per annum per household. And as you can see, from 2008 to 2019, it went down, in fact, by 19% per household. It's a very useful and significant contribution to the UK's electricity use. But because we've got more households, in reality, it's only a 13% drop in total electricity use. And I've used just electricity. I haven't applied it to appliances specifically. It's not easy to do that. So there's a little bit of electricity for heating controls, boiler pumps and things in there. And there's a little bit of gas for cooking that's not in there as far as appliances are concerned. But yes, we've been doing very well and reducing electricity demand. Now, the policy approach that we used with Decade has been known as market transformation. And it's really two bits of this that I'm focusing on today. You can't look at energy efficiency without looking at the energy efficiency of each individual product, house, or whatever. And in this particular slide, you've got the standard assessment procedure, SAP, on the x-axis, and you've got a percentage of the households that have got each of those categories, which is the blue distribution. And what we're trying to do with policy is take that blue distribution to a green distribution. Don't worry about the specific numbers in this case. It's just that, first of all, you have to have a label. And secondly, as it shows here, you have to have a mandatory minimum standard to get rid of the worst. Doesn't matter whether it's houses, fridges or whatever. You've got to start cutting off that long tail of energy inefficient products at the same time as you encourage more efficient ones through various different policies. I'm not going into those policies today. All I'm looking at is the label and the minimum standards. To start with, I hope most of you have already seen an energy label on some product. This one I've given you here is from off our television, which we seem to have bought in 2017. The 7 bands are familiar. Originally, they were all from A to G on all of the labels. But as new products came onto the market, the A band got extended to A+, and in this case, A++. And so F and G got dropped off the bottom. A great deal of work went in. This is please note, this is very definitely a European label. A great deal of work went into at the Commission, making sure that the conditions for labelling an appliance were utterly rigorous and standard across all, as it is or was, 28 member states. You've got laboratories in each country having to comply with the procedure set down to make sure that if it's an A-rated product in one country, it's an A-rated product in another. Somebody's noisy. I don't know if somebody could mute. There's some funny noises coming to me. Anyway, the importance of an energy label is that it's visible. It should be on the front of every product in the showroom so that when you, the consumer, go in, you can compare this product with that product and its energy efficiency if you're so minded. And it's pretty easy to understand. You can see from the length of the bars and the colours on the bars, and if you compare properly, the numbers, in this case it's 26 kilowatt hours per annum, is the usage of this 18-watt television. That label, this label is, or something similar, is on at least 40 products across Europe at the moment, so it's widely understood and widely recognised. Now, what we're about to do is introduce a new energy label. It's the first time since the first label was introduced in 1995, and we've now got a new label coming in next month. And it's quite interesting because this one is quite clearly a British label. How much that's to do with Brexit and how, I'm not sure, and I don't know enough about what else is changing, but it's still got the same 7 bands. And what is happening from now onwards is that it's being rescaled. So it might have been a C-rated before, A-rated before, and it's now C-rated. This is actually for a dishwasher. You can tell that because it's got 12 place settings. And it's including now somewhat more energy services, the length of time and a dishwasher with an eco program takes, its noise, the amount of water, the number of place settings, the amount of energy, and the amount of energy per 100 uses. It's a slightly different way of identifying energy use, but that's now explicit. So we've got various ways in which the energy label is being improved or changed, but it's still there across, as I said, 40 product standards. What are the important issues in making sure that a label is accurate and useful? I've stressed the procedure in laboratory tests, you probably wouldn't believe the amount of effort that went into making sure these were useful. One of the ones we got involved in at the ECI was the laboratory test for an oven, and there was a lot of debate as to what was a standard meal across all member states, and it came across that a roast chicken is. And then you have to find out how would you identify a standard something to represent a roast chicken. So it became a moist brick. So that is the basis on which the laboratory tests are done for ovens across Europe. At one point, just to make sure the laboratories were being consistent, there were round robins undertaken. So exactly the same appliance got tested in different laboratories in France or Germany or Italy or UK, because there's such an emphasis on consistency. And initially there was a certain amount of cheating. What happened after a while is that the trade association said that manufacturer A can privately challenge manufacturer B if they thought that a product was wrongly labelled, and the manufacturer that was wrong paid the costs. And with tests, for instance, on a cold appliance, a fridge or a freezer, that's quite an expensive process. Because the one thing that a label must do, it must be consistent, it must be trustworthy, it must be on 100% of products. Otherwise, the consumer has not got confidence in it, can't trust it, and can't make the comparisons properly. Now, I said some of the data is rather old. On fridge freezers, the first of the cold appliances to be labelled, or the first appliance to be labelled across Europe, the label was introduced in 1995, and we were working on products at that stage in lower carbon futures, and we bought a certain amount of data about those products that were on the market. And here they are ranked according to the volume of the fridge freezer and excuse me, and the number of kilowatt hours per annum, and how that fitted into the 7 bands. And as you can see, there's quite a distribution. At any one size, there is a factor of greater than 2 in terms of the efficiency of an appliance. And of course, in 1995, nobody knew that. It was only when the label and the labelling procedure came into operation that anybody had any idea as to the real range in energy efficiency on the market. The manufacturers used to say that the consumers didn't care about energy efficiency because we never asked about it. Well, we couldn't ask about it because we didn't know it varied so much. However, and the other thing I just wanted to mention was that G, because it's an open-ended category, the worst category, this can be a very substantial, and there was a very substantial range in the G products. You'll see here also this 1999 line, the dark line between C and D. Right from early on, the European Commission announced there would be a mandatory minimum standard coming in 1999. It couldn't come in until there was a label, but the Commission gave considerable notice that it was coming in. As a result of which, this was the distribution in 2001 of the new appliances on the market, the pink squares, mauve squares, and the original blue dots. If the 1999 standard had been 100% enforced, 2/3 of the blue dots, the original appliances, would have been taken off the market. There was a little bit of overlap still. It takes time to, it certainly took time then because not everybody was used to the procedure. And there was a little bit of, well, it's in stock, so I'll sell it type approach. The thing that I want to mention here, most of all, is this very substantial growth in the size of fridge freezers in the 6 years between 1995 and 2001. There were none of them there in 1995, and a very substantial increase in the number of models. And even though they're A, B or C rated, even though they complied with the standard, they were very large. They were those two-door American style fridge freezers. And it's not clear to me that there was a demand from consumers, but they certainly were provided by manufacturers who wanted to make sure they still had high-end products for sale. So how do you make mandatory minimum standards effective? You certainly declare them well in advance. The design cycle on a cold appliance, a fridge or a freezer, a fridge freezer, is about every 3 years. So as long as you've given 3 years, and the Commission gave at least 4, then you've not actually caused the manufacturers a design problem. They were going to redesign anyway. You've just given them the criteria by which they should judge a new design. It has to be mandatory at the point of sale. If you've got a lot in stock, and that we've found this out with light bulbs as well, that diffuses the benefit of the policy. It's extremely easy for trading standards officers to enforce a mandatory minimum standard in a retail outlet if the label is accurate and highly visible as it should be. If you go in, you see all of the labels are showing that they are A to C, there aren't any Ds or worse, then you know that the compliance has been achieved and you can walk out, job done, 2 seconds. And if it's well enforced, and the labels are compliant, then you prevent dumping. There has been opportunities for dumping when an appliance, for instance, hasn't been properly labelled. So what was the net effect between 1995 and 2001 of first of all bringing in labels based on a test procedure and then a mandatory minimum standard? And just over, in other words, based on those 6 years that I was showing in the 2 distributions. If everything was 100, an index of 100 in 1995, by 2001, there were 10% more cold appliances in the stock of British homes. There were more homes, and we were more likely to have a fridge freezer. We were, in fact, that's partly getting rid of fridges and freezers and going for fridge freezers. The size, as I mentioned, of those new appliances was bigger. They were 15% bigger on average than they had been in 1995. Yes, they were very much more energy efficient. The index had dropped from 100 to 75 because of the mandatory, over that period, because of the mandatory minimum standards. Because they were bigger, the electricity consumption only decreased from 100 to 81. So the net effect of the bigger fridge, the more appliances, the total electricity consumption in that year dropped only from 100 to 99. It was only a small decrease, partly because of the much greater level of energy service being obtained by consumers with a bigger fridge that was more energy efficient and using less per fridge. Now, one of the most surprising things was this 90. The price of a new fridge or fridge freezer, a new cold appliance, in 2001 was 10% lower than it had been in 1995. The manufacturers knew that they had to compete on energy efficiency, and compete they did. So consumers were doing particularly well. They had lower running costs, more space, and it cost them less. So this was a brilliant set of achievements. And of course, with a mandatory minimum standard, whatever is sold from 2001 onwards will also be more efficient. So the benefits over time would be increasing. Sarah, I don't know whether there are any questions lurking.
Yes, there are. You have 2 already, Brenda. So Phil Grunewald is asking, he says, when I bought our fridge, it was labelled A. but by now it might well have become D or worse. But I've no way of knowing when I should replace it. So this is the issue of embodied energy, material waste versus energy waste. And he says, should we have a better way to give feedback on performance in the field?
Oh, Phil. The appliance, whether it's labelled A or D, has not changed. Its energy consumption has not changed. It is no worse when it's labelled as a D than it is as an A in actual practice. So in terms of replacing it, don't worry, don't change your habits, don't change your buying procedure. I'm not going to go into the should we have a better way. That's a long discussion, and maybe come back at the end if I've got more time to think about that. Then, Sarah, the other question.
Right. Yes. There is. Yes, and actually there's a third one that's come up as well. But this next one, I think, may be anticipating what you're going to say a bit later, Brenda. But it's a comment from Daniel Scharf that there's likely to be stiff competition for electricity in the transition to net zero, given that there's going to be extra electricity demanded for transport and heating and manufacturing. Have personal electricity allowances been considered as an alternative to personal carbon allowances?
Coming up, a bit of that's coming up later, Daniel.
Yeah, okay. And then Pietro Altamat asks, did the price drop mainly because more fridges were manufactured in Asia? And Ian Burns suggests Turkey as well. So the Beko fridge freezers and so on.
Pietro, my memory doesn't take me back to that, and I'm not sure we ever knew completely where they were manufactured. Yes, you were quite right. Turkish and Beko appliances were coming on the market at that stage. I think the price dropped because of competition, because the manufacturers really didn't know how important energy efficiency was really going to be. They'd always assumed it wasn't going to be, but the minute that the 1995 label appeared, they started having all sorts of adverts about energy efficiency. So they professed to assume that consumers didn't care, but actually they were really worried about it. So I think, and they were probably quite glad to have a new marketing tool. One of the things that was happening in 1995, people were beginning to try and do things like design curvy fridges because they didn't know how else to differentiate. So I think it's basically competition and learning about how energy efficiency fitted into consumers' issues.
Right.
Okay.
And there's a comment about from John Twidell about putting a kilowatt hour meter on each device in an obvious position, that because they don't cost much, as a suggestion. And then there's a query, I'm not sure quite who from, but with sustainability very much in mind overall. Have you looked at the effect of the change of refrigerant gases, firstly to HFCs and then to natural refrigerants like HC and CO2?
That comes under a different set of policies, and it wasn't part of what we were looking at, but it's very definitely part of policy towards fridges. That's quite right, because of Montreal Protocol and CFCs, etc. The John Twidell and meters. You can put a meter on your own appliance between the appliance and the plug if you want to see what it's actually consuming. But for test procedures, you want the standard conditions. You know, this showroom or this house is a different temperature to that one, so you'd get a different reading. All right, I'm going to zoom on. I'm now going to go. I'm now going over to lighting. Lighting is another major user of electricity within the home. And over the last few years, we've had a very substantial range of lighting products. We started off with the incandescent, the GLS 40 watt, 60 watt, 100 watt, halogens, compact fluorescent lamps, or for quite a while, linear fluorescent, and now light emitting diodes. The efficacy, the lumens per watt, the amount of light you get for the wattage that you're putting into it, a measure of efficiency effectively, varies over this range from 10 to 150. There's a 15-fold variation in the efficiency of the light bulbs that we've been using in our homes since about 1995, I think. Now, the European Commission started a series of policies to phase out the least efficient bulbs as they saw them. And actually the UK government, fortunately, decided to do it a little bit more quickly, a year earlier. So we phased them out in 2008, 2009, 2010, and then 2016. What you've got here is a very substantial improvement in the energy efficiency of the product being used, partly because of minimum standards. They weren't totally well enforced in this country, but actually the supermarkets were the ones that were most concerned about the efficiency, partly because there was a label on the box, but it wasn't terribly big, or it wasn't multicolored in all cases. And I don't think the label had a huge impact on us as consumers, but certainly the minimum standards coming in did make the supermarkets one of the major retail outlets for light bulbs. It certainly made them concerned because they couldn't be reported to the commissioners not complying. So the net effect of those changing light bulbs was that our annual household electricity use has decreased from 720 kilowatt hours a year when we only had 20 bulbs in the house. And now on average, we've got 34, and we're just under 400 kilowatt hours in 2019. And it'll of course be lower than that now, which is a 45% reduction in 22 years. It's at least 2% per annum, despite there being 70% more bulbs. And one of the most interesting things is that of those 34 bulbs, only 27 are LEDs. Those super efficient LEDs right at the bottom. We've still got did I say, I hope I got that the right way around. Only 7 of the 34 are LEDs, only 22%. The other 27 are not. We've got a huge potential for energy efficiency improvements in lighting through the dispersal through our housing stock as we gradually buy them, through installing LEDs. And one of the things to remember is that with fridges, with light bulbs, with lots of these other products that we have, appliances in our homes, we're going to buy them anyway. If your light bulb blows or your fridge goes, you're going to replace it. So as long as there are mandatory minimum standards saying you've got to replace it with something that's more efficient, you have no other choice. It is an extremely effective set of policies. So labels were introduced, as I say, in 1990. Well, they were announced in 1999, and they were on boxes from 2001, and it influenced the manufacturers and the retailers. The minimum standards were reasonably effective. They're not totally perfect. If you really insisted, you can go on the web and buy an incandescent bulb today, and people like the Daily Mail encouraged you to. And we did have other policies. There were subsidies through the supermarkets, and we gave away a huge number, something like 300 million CFLs at one stage. So there were supporting policies there as well. And another one that was useful was that the UK building regulations required dedicated fittings in new properties. A dedicated fitting is one that can't take one of the old bulbs. So it's often, and we've seen them much more now, in fact, you can't take the bulb out. The luminaire and the light bulb go together, the fitting and the light bulb go together, which is a sort of useful form of procurement. So I'm not saying that it was mandatory minimum standards and labelling on their own, but they have been very effective at reducing our total demand. So I think the lesson we can learn from appliances is that product standards are very powerful policy combination, particularly if you take the whole market transformation approach. And within that, labels and minimum standards are the most effective. You can't have minimum standards without labels. You can't really have anything till you've got a label, till you can differentiate one product and its energy efficiency from another. It does mean that both the UK and the European Commission have to enforce the policy, whether through rigorous test procedure, whether through rigorous enforcement of the labels being on the appliances. Energy conservation will result quite naturally over time because the purchase was going to happen anyway. The speed with which that conservation happens depends on the lifetime of the appliance. Going back to Phil and his cold appliance, on average it lasts about 14 years. If we delay with policy, it is costly. Some people are going out there buying inefficient products when they could have been buying efficient ones. All right, Sarah, next pause.
Okay. There are some comments in the chat line as well, but I think given time constraints, I'll just give you the question, Brenda. It's from Peter Stratford, and he's saying, he's asking, how does the rating of different appliances compare? For example, is an A fridge the same hours per year as an A oven, or is the rating appliance specific? And if that's the case, then which appliances are more important to be efficient?
Well, Peter, no, the rating is very definitely specific to the test procedure, which is specific to the product. So there is absolutely, and all you can do is compare one fridge with another, one oven with another, one TV with another. That's all the label asks you to do. What has varied a bit in a slightly unpredictable way is the extent to which the average on the market has been D at the beginning of the labelling. It should have been, if that was the sort of sensible distribution, but in some cases there's been more room for an A appliance to grow and become an A+, and in other cases there's been a lot of room just to grow into A. I don't think I've quite answered all of your
so which appliances are the most important? Yes.
Well, that depends a bit on you and your house. I mean, if you've got no dishwasher, you've got no tumble dryer, but you've got 50 light bulbs, then go for light bulbs. It depends a bit on your lifestyle. One of the things that's been happening in particular in the last few years is our growth in consumer electronics. And of course, that will have been happening much more, the energy we use in our computers and everything since COVID and working at home. Most of those are relatively low wattage appliances, but some of them are left on a huge amount of the time. So, and you know, if you've got 2 screens and 1 computer and you've got a printer in the background, you start adding up quite considerably. So all I would, you can look at Phil Grunwald's research because he gives you more information on what we're actually using in his meter project. But it's largely up to you.
But you started your work, Brenda, on the cold appliances, didn't you? Because they're on all the time, switched on all the time. Yeah.
Yes. And yes. Thank you, Sarah. Yes. But we've had 4 minimum standards now altogether on cold appliances. So the extent to which they can be better in future is also becoming restricted. Whereas whereas with washing machines, the test procedure is quite difficult, so they haven't had so many minimum standards. It's a fascinating area.
Yes.
All right.
And given what you've just said about computers and IT devices, Andrew Warren is asking, why is there no labelling for computer equipment?
Andrew, I'm not totally up to date with this, and see if anybody else can improve on this statement, but my understanding is that it's extremely difficult with things like computers and laptops because the technology changes more quickly than the test procedure could be devised. I mean, if it's going to take you 2 years to devise a test procedure, but actually the appliances come up with new technology every year, then you're on a loser. So I don't know whether, Sarah, do you know if that's still true?
Yes, that's what we tell our students. Yeah, okay. It's very hard to keep pace. Yeah,
it's very hard. Yes. Okay. Now I'm going to go over to housing. I think I've shown you so far that there's a lot of benefits that we've already accrued from good labels and good minimum standards on appliances. Now, what I want to do is look and see what is happening with housing and the extent to which we could do better with housing. And first of all, I want to show you this slide on the standard assessment procedure, which is the way that we judge the energy efficiency of housing, and it was what was on the x-axis in that very early market transformation slide that I showed you, and the energy uses in the home that are not included in SAP. So SAP covers space and water heating and fixed lighting. So it's not quite solely gas, but it's almost exclusively gas. The non-SAP is all other appliances and lighting, which is most electricity. And so I've been dealing with this to start with, and I'm now going to look at the other proportion of energy used in the home. And one thing I want to particularly identify is that in terms of kilowatt hours per annum, 83% is covered by SAP. In terms of carbon, particularly as electricity is becoming less carbon intensive, more of the share is left in gas, so that's 78%. But what we very often ignore is the fact that SAP only covers something in the region of 42% of the household expenditure. This is completely crucial for the fuel poor, because we're largely, as far as the fuel poor are concerned, ignoring, in terms of additional policies to the ones that I've mentioned, the 50% that is their electricity expenditure. And this is a split that we've not been good at looking at. We used to have a different method before the Energy Performance Certificate. We used to have a thing called the NHER, National Home Energy Rating, and that included 100%. But we've moved away, partly because of the European policy, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. I've always rather liked this statement from David McKay. It is frustratingly hard to make a really big dent in the leakiness of an already built house. I so totally agree with him. And that is one of the problems. I'm not in any way trying to pretend that a house is like a fridge. Oh, it may be cold, but I'm not trying to say that the policy applied to housing is as easy as policy applied to a fridge. What I am going to try and do is show that we could do the policy on housing a great deal better than we are doing at the moment. One of the reasons why housing is particularly difficult is because every home plus its occupants is in fact unique. The way I would use your house if I moved into it is different from the way that you use it. And unfortunately, at the moment, as I'm hoping to prove to you, we do not have a good, trusted, reliable label, and nor do we have good, effective minimum standards. So the two core policies are not working well with housing. Now this is the energy performance certificate, as you will see on a property. It's the same 7 bands. We're a long way off having A pluses, so we've still got the same A to G. It is based on pounds per square meter, so the cost of the energy is actually incorporated. It says it's called energy efficiency rating, but it's actually an energy efficiency and cost rating. And when you get an EPC, not only do you get the energy part and the carbon part, but you also get improvements. The current average is a D. It's about 63. There's several policies which actually want us to get to C, and that's every single property that's occupied. And if we want to really deliver on zero carbon housing, we've probably got to get every house to an A. These are fantastically difficult things to achieve, and as I say, we're not doing terribly well at the moment. One of the aspects of the energy performance certificate, just like the fridge freezer, it's based on a standard conditions. In this case, that your property is warm. And this causes all sorts of confusions, not least for politicians, so that when they say you'll save £300 on doing X or Y or Z, what they mean is you would have saved £300 if you were going to be warm, but actually you're not. So there's lots of room for slippage and inaccuracy. Another of the problems is that I always hesitate over saying this because I'm sure most of you won't believe me, but it's actually based on primary energy. It takes you a lot of looking at information. It comes in lower down on the EPC, the pages of information that you get, which means that it's extremely difficult for both being fully warm and primary energy makes it an almost impossible comparison for the average person, if not the skilled person, looking at it. I'm not going to do a lot on the detail of how the audit is undertaken, but I do want to just say that there are certain things omitted, partly because it's very difficult to include, and that in particular is the rate of air movement in a property. The air changes per hour completely distribute your warm air if it's leaking through a gap in the building fabric somewhere. None of us know what that is in reality in our own properties. There is no expert who can come into a house and say this is a half air change per hour or a 1 air change per hour. And the only way you can actually test it, if you were going to do it properly, is at the moment is a blower door, which puts the house under pressure. So although it identifies the leakiness, it does it at pressure, which is also not terribly helpful. So if you can't include a substantial amount of the heat loss within a property, you also can't show how to improve it. So there's virtually no information provided on how to put in mechanical ventilation or do draft proofing or whatever. Even if you put in good draft proofing, it only improves it by something like 1 sat point. There are lots of other problems. Solid walls are not treated well, but I don't want to go into that in much detail. I just want to look at what the EPC is meant to be doing. Now, as I've implied so far, it's first of all to compare building A with building B under identical conditions, i.e. comparably warm, so that you, when you're buying the house, can say, okay, this is a D-rated house, this is a C-rated house. I know that this one is more, the C-rated house is slightly more energy efficient. So it does give you the opportunity to compare buildings at the point of sale or when you're renting. Yes, it's a theoretical standard. You're all assumed to be warm. It's at standard uniform fuel prices, but the fuel price varies very substantially. The occupancy is based on pounds per square metre. We do not have a requirement at the moment that it is on all buildings. You have to have it at the point of sale, you have to have it at the point of rental, and you have to have it if it's new build. So that is how to compare buildings. but at the same time we're giving recommendations for the occupants, and that should in some way be related to the occupants and their wishes. But at the moment we have a generic set of recommendations, whereas what we really want is specific ones. So the two functions of the energy performance certificate are not helping terribly well in either case. It's acknowledged now, even within government, that the energy performance certificate is failing on several counts. In recent BEIS consultations, they identified that the EPC is not really helping householders. Of the 145 respondents who replied to the consultation on the EPC, only 5 thought that the reliability of EPCs is good. Now, this is a combination of the auditing process and the auditor, the assessor that has done the work. Sometimes those vary. We've had 2 done on this property, and there was a 10% variation in the square meters that they thought the property was, even though nothing had changed. In a separate consultation, 6% of householders knew the EPC of their property, and only 2% said they had acted on it. We believe that with labels on fridge freezers, for instance, that are up to 60% of people could be influenced by the label. I think it's probably grown over time, but so 2%, it's a policy that is not working. The EPC should be shown to prospective purchasers or renters. I think it's there in most estate agents' windows now, but it's certainly nowhere near as strongly evident and enforced for people renting property. So you could be renting something and not know that you're going to incur large fuel bills when you do it. In addition, through an academic paper from UCL, they identify that there is a certain amount of slippage in terms of accuracy. So they think that something in the region of 25% of properties that are actually band D were listed as band C, one better. Now, increasingly, we're getting policies like minimum standards where the band of the property is crucial. So if we're going to get cheating or slippage or inaccuracy or whatever you want to call it, this completely disrupts the policy, because something could get through because it's C rated on the EPC, even though it should have been rated a D. So we like policy based on bands. It's a very helpful process. It's very easy for consumers and householders to understand, but it goes increasingly encouraging cheating. There's some very anecdotal evidence that cheating is increasing. Now, in theory, out of the 28 million households in this country, there are meant to be 21 million EPCs. I've always been slightly uncertain about that figure. So I did a survey of our road. This is all information that's online, excuse me, easy to obtain. So of the 57 properties in North Oxford, 51% had no EPC, 8% had one that had expired. We had one F property, one B, and the rest were in between. Nobody tells you that your EPC has expired. There were also 2 or 3 properties that were listed twice. Ours was listed twice because we've had 2 EPCs. So part of the 21 million is properties that are EPCs that are no longer valid or duplicates. This is not particularly helpful. I have to, one caveat in that some people do choose not to have their energy performance certificate identified. So it may be that several people in the road have done that, but I don't know. Just to confirm, there is a very large range in the space heating required to achieve the delivered energy required to achieve the same standard in different properties. the severely fuel poor, the G-rated type of property, it could be as bad as 400 kilowatt hours per square metre per annum. The average in the stock was in 2016 was 150. If you did a brand new home to passive house standard, which is a German super efficient standard, you'd be down at 15. And if you applied a passive house to a retrofit, which is called Enofit, it's 25. So there's at least a factor of 10 between the average and the very best new, and unfortunately a much bigger range if you're dealing with the worst housing. So making energy efficiency standards work would be very, and really effective would be worthwhile, especially for the fuel poor. And I mentioned passive house. For those of you that don't know about it, it's called passive house because there's no moving parts in the heating system, so they're passive. It relies on a building which is super insulated, and that the heating comes either from the occupants or from the equipment and the lighting. So what that means is the heating will be provided by a small oil-filled electric radiator or a wood stove or similar. So it's not a proper system as we normally refer to it. So when it's extra cold at the weekend, you invite more people round because they're all your little radiators. We quite like that little cartoon, but of course not applicable with COVID. So where are we on housing and minimum efficiency standards? In 2017, the government came out and said, as an aspiration, didn't bring out a policy, just an aspiration, that as many homes as possible to be an EPC band C by 2035, where practical, cost-effective and affordable. All of those words could be debated. There have been some bits of legislation, but so far the legislation that we've had has failed or is failing either on getting minimum standards into fuel poor homes or the privately rented sector, or as I mentioned, when getting information across to the rented sector. So it's not possible to say there is a good policy on mandatory minimum efficiency standards. It's not clear. There are piecemeal. It's not coherent. It's not integrated. It's not particularly effective. However, I can't deny, and I'm not trying to deny, that there has been considerable progress across the whole housing stock. If you look at the period 1996 to 2018, the energy efficiency of the housing stock has been improving. I think that should be decreasing, not increasing. In other words, because we're going from 0 to 100, so the SAP points have been changing at 0.88 per annum, points per annum. If we're going to get to A-rated 100 by 2050, we have to say get to 100, get to 1.14 SAP points per annum. That is 30% faster. We're not in any way changing the energy efficiency of the housing stock fast enough. Now, somewhere in government there is some recognition of this, and an EPC Action Plan was produced in September. They'd had a consultation before, which was partly what I was quoting. There's 35 proposals in this action plan, 12 of which had to be completed in 2020, even though the plan only came out in September. I don't know how we would find out if any of those 12 have been effective or what implemented. And some of you know I'm very keen on verbs. Most of the 35 proposals, the vast majority, used consult, investigate, consider, or improve. There was only one which used ensure. Now, it's an important one. What they actually said was, we will ensure that EPCs are accurate and may be relied upon for use in other government policies. Well, I don't know how they're going to ensure it. It had no time limit on that. And it would be good if they could. An alternative option to energy performance certificates and the way that they work at the moment is to add in personal consumption data. As I mentioned, they're meant to help you with recommendations on what to do with your property. And at the moment, there is no link with your personal consumption data, your annual fuel bills. There is a thing called a display energy certificate for commercial buildings, and it's very easy. You take the EPC and you put into it the actual fuel bill data and rank on that basis. There is a little bit of discussion as to whether the EPC, or at least a parallel EPC, should be doing that. So just to bring this all together, what I've been talking about is in the housing section is this energy use. It's the theoretical energy use covered by the EPC, and it's mainly gas. And there's a similar one for residential one I've been discussing, and business has got a similar one. But it's theoretical. As I said, it's mainly gas, 83% of energy in 2018. As far as the occupant is concerned, rather than the property owner, if you want to look at 100% of all energy use, then something like a display energy certificate would be useful, helpful, as it is with businesses. Or if you don't want to do that, and it's very difficult to see how a display energy certificate would be displayed on every house or incorporated into any policy on every house, you could have personal carbon allowances. And I happen to be deeply wedded to personal carbon allowances, as some of you know. Now, we've been a personal carbon allowance is a way of nudging behaviour. We've been seeing quite a lot of the influence of behaviour. For instance, over buying bigger fridges or more light bulbs or more consumer electronics. You and I are not made to face up to the implications of that, except through the electricity bill, which may or may not even be noticed by us. Now, personal carbon allowances, we did quite a lot of work, Tina Fawcett in particular, at the ECI Lower Carbon Futures, but it was a concept that was developed in particular by David Fleming, and it goes by several different names: tradable, domestic quotas, etc. There's a new initiative, and it's really fascinating that this is coming out. James Hansen, the renowned American environmentalist, and some American students have come up with a carbon fee and dividend. That is a fee that's placed on the fossil fuel producers, suppliers, at the mine or when it comes into the country. And the dividend is that money is returned to each householder. There's some similarities between these two approaches. I can't go into them in any more detail because I haven't. But in both cases, either every household or every person is included. In both cases, 100% of the money is kept in the scheme. There is no government rake-off. In both cases, it is designed and should be, in practice, progressive, giving money back to the poorest people who use the least energy, rather than be a regressive scheme, as so many are often. Depending on which scheme you're looking at, it's perhaps 50 to 70% of the poorest people would be better off. In both cases, the standard applied becomes tighter over time. In both cases, it affects behaviour. The extent to which it's through price and trading, price in particular with the fee and dividend, or psychologically, which is my perspective, not everybody's, on the personal carbon allowance, that you try and stay within the allowance as much as possible. It is an alternative to carbon taxation, and in my mind preferable because it's fixed on an amount rather than necessarily a price and hoping the amount follows. The fee and dividend covers all commodities, whereas the personal carbon allowance looks at direct energy purchases. So there is a hope that maybe some of our behaviour will be coming in on this. I'll just put that in at the end. So what are our lessons? Labels on appliances are accurate, visible, understood, and quite often acted upon. I don't think there's very recent information on how often they're acted upon, and that may well be over 60% now. Labels on houses are of variable quality, either because of the way the assessor behaves or because of the audit procedure. It's very rarely visible, and it's often unnoticed, even if it's part of policy that you should notice it. The mandatory minimum standards for appliances have been effective, particularly because manufacturers are given good notice, whereas on houses there's minimal awareness. You and I often don't know what we're meant to be doing, and even when we're told about them, for instance, that we've got to get our homes to a C standard, it's really quite difficult to know what that means in practice. And now we have got post-Brexit. It's very uncertain what is going to happen to appliance standards. As I showed you, the new label is a British label, not a European one. If we try and keep pace with what is happening in Europe, that would be brilliant. But if equivalence is not maintained, there is a risk, and enforcement is low, there's a real risk of dumping. We had quite a lot of dumping of poor quality LEDs originally. The UK could, and perhaps should, unilaterally introduce tougher standards and be proactive, particularly with lighting, and particularly, for instance, phasing out all halogens. What we mustn't do, please, after Brexit, is jettison what has been good and effective energy efficiency policy.
Brenda, thank you. That was excellent. And it stimulated quite a lot of questions.
Good.
I'm going to put together two. They come from Jake Backus and from Daniel Scharf, and they're to do with the size of houses and level of occupation. And Jake is asking, do you think one option might be to make council tax based on energy consumption rather than house value, or some combination? Because then bigger houses would tend to use more energy. This would be an incentive for houses to cut their consumption. And Daniel, a bit lower down, says the level of construction carbon, so the embodied carbon, that's a driver towards retrofitting rather than new build. But given the scale of under-occupation, without subdivisions, I guess this is dividing up the big houses, this will mean heating and insulating space and fabric rather than actually meeting housing need.
Yes, Jake, I'm not generally in favour of linking energy efficiency and council tax. It's a bit since I've looked at it in detail, but I don't want to penalise the poorest people for living in the most energy inefficient homes by putting on extra council tax when they've already proved they haven't got the money, or they haven't got a landlord to invest in that energy efficiency. It's really quite difficult to make sure that whatever policy you're bringing in doesn't penalise those who are already penalised. Now, I think I'll leave it at there. It's quite a big debate. And Daniel, yes, embodied energy is a big issue. And maybe one reason why you should do retrofitting. And I don't know if Gavin's online, but he's the one that knows much more about this than I do. One of the difficulties we've got is that it's very difficult to as I implied, to know what's the best thing to do to your own individual house. I mean, we've got a Edwardian terraced house, and I really don't know. I think we're C at the moment, but I don't know how to. I haven't the slightest idea how we're going to get to an A. even though I keep thinking about it, needless to say. So it may well be there's more embodied energy in brand new homes, but if we could bring them up to a really good standard, that would be better. The difficulty we've got at the moment is we haven't been enforcing building regs. We've been making them rather weak. As anybody who's been following the Grenfell debate knows, they've been lax for many years. Even when they are built to the standard, in theory, they're often not built in practice. It's the calibre of the work that we do on our properties. Under occupancy is an issue, and it would be good if we could convert big houses into little houses or little flats or something. But even there, it's not very easy. So yes, there are a lot of issues around making the stock more energy efficient. Yeah. And
a question from Nick Jelly, going straight for the big issue about whether it's best to concentrate on supply or demand side. Is it more cost effective to decarbonise heating than to improve the leakage of homes?
Well, actually, Nick, it's not an either or. The decarbonised heating that we're thinking of installing in our homes, if it's a heat pump, it's very expensive to run if you have got an energy inefficient home. So you've actually got to make it much more energy efficient to start with before you should even contemplate putting a heat pump in. And I have to say that if I've spent X thousand pounds on making the home energy efficient, do I then want to spend another X thousand pounds or whatever on putting in a new heating system? I think that's really quite a difficult debate. So it's not an either or. We've got to decarbonise the supply and we have to reduce demand. Excuse me. And as Nick Eyre said to me on one occasion, the issue about electricity is that we've no idea how much electricity is going to actually go into vehicles. But if we were all to have an electric car and all charged it up at night, there wouldn't need to be a new supply. Just a minute, Sarah, I've got a cough. Okay, next question.
Right. Peter Stratford, yes, this is a house is not a fridge related issue. The main issue he's proposing with EPCs is that the housing market is completely dominated by non-energy factors like location and the size of the mortgage. And most purchasers simply don't consider it because the energy costs are so small compared with the other costs they're facing.
That is absolutely right. But there is an attempt to, I'm sorry, what was the name of that questioner?
Peter Stratford.
Oh, Peter. There is an attempt to get policy to look at energy efficient properties becoming more valuable. I mean, the government has actually said that in a couple of their policy statements. And in theory, if it was really implemented well, mandatory minimum standards, proper labelling would mean that we know about the energy efficiency of our properties. And if the government was to, for instance, say, and well, they've said it, but actually mean it, we want all properties to be C by 2035. And if you knew that they were buying a property that was not a C, then you'd say to the person, okay, I will reduce my offer to you to buy that property because I know I've got to spend 20, 30, whatever £1,000 on making this property C rated. So gradually over time, energy inefficient properties in similar localities would actually become less valuable. And I know at the moment that's not true, but that is it is partly what's being discussed in policy as a move. But you can't do it unless there's an extraordinarily clear statement of government policy that is well backed up by labelling and appliance and housing standards.
Yeah. Ian Byrne commenting on just how difficult it is now to find EPCs online, because there's been a move to the Gov.uk website, raising the point about display energy certificates, which actually say how much energy is used, rather than the estimate that you get from the EPC, and pointing out they only apply to public buildings, but they are, of course, a way of telling people how much energy a building uses if they're displayed, though they often aren't. Yes, absolutely no enforcement of DEC policy in the public sector, says Andrew Warren. And Ian tells of auditing a small public body last year. It had declared a climate emergency, never heard of DECs. Yes, it's the lamentable state of information, really, about how much energy our buildings are using.
And Sarah, I suspect if we were ever to move to something like display energy certificate for housing, there'd be all sorts of discussions about public availability of private data.
Yes, I mean, what people do have, of course, is their bill, isn't it?
Yes, but it's I mean, most people, if you ask them about the bill, you know, how much energy are you using? They'll come out and say, all right, I'm spending £100 a month on energy. They don't really know what their total bill is. It's spread across the year because of direct debits, etc., etc. So we're not really well informed.
There's also a point about this is a compliance one too. The standard for new homes may now be quite high, but the build quality is often poor. So that's, yes, a question of how do you actually achieve those standards?
Well, number one, if you are trying to make sure that the standard of this new housing estate is good, I'm not quite sure what percentage of homes have to be tested at the moment, but it's not high. I mean, I don't know whether it's 1% or 10%, but it's not many. And usually the builder says to you, oh, well, this is the one for you to test, and that's the one they've been most careful about. So the other 90% of the homes are never tested and may never be anywhere near the right standard. There are some hopeful signs. We mustn't get totally depressed. There are things called PAS 2035, which is a standard for retrofit of housing, and Trustmark, which is a standard for the people doing the work. And there is effort going into getting both of those to be reliable and good. The real difficulty, of course, is that you're dealing with a workforce which isn't used to being regulated or tested, and so it's going to take us some time to get it through the housing stock and retrofits that are happening. And in addition, what we found in Oxford so far is that if you want to get somebody, for instance, who's a good tradesperson, they're already busy and don't want to be part of a new scheme. I mean, this is the Green Homes Grant, which came in last year and is woefully underspent for a variety of reasons. In Oxford, if you wanted to do it, you wouldn't be able to find somebody, you probably wouldn't be able to find somebody who would do it, because the busy ones don't want to get involved with all that bureaucracy.
A comment here, we use the SKA standard for retrofits, being better than BREEAM. That's something you're familiar with, Brenda?
No, I don't know about that.
No. Okay, right.
Sorry, can't help.
And there was a point of clarification from Ian Byrne about your slide where you showed the SAP costs and the non-SAP costs.
Yeah.
And there was a 50% and a 42%, and he's asking, is the remaining 8% standing charges?
No, it's other fuels.
Oh, right. Okay.
Sorry about that. I should have said. So there's a little bit of wood and gas and oil and things like that in there.
Oh, right. Thank you. Yes. And I mean, going back to your main thesis, Brenda, that we can apply what we've done, what we've learnt from appliances, we can then apply that to housing, because really the appliance labelling by and large has been a success story. And just to be awkward, I'm just going to get back to that and say, well, maybe we can't really, because a house is just so different, because a house is a home and there are so many different things that people want to do with a home. And whereas there's only really one thing you can do with a fridge, you know, it's complicated, and perhaps you have to have quite a different approach, and it needs to involve a lot of conversations with people about what they want from a building.
Oh, I think that is absolutely true, Sarah. I'm not saying the solutions are all the same. I do think that we could do better on the way that we try to label. We're not even able to compare properties really effectively with the present EPC. There's just too much uncertainty, and you know, as I said, there are people cheating out there, and I mean, the trouble is also there's lots of anecdotal evidence and very little actual research. But excuse me, someone was telling me that they could get an EPC done for £35, providing somebody didn't come into the property. Well, it's actually a requirement that you go into the property, but there's somebody, you know, you and I wouldn't know that necessarily, and yet we were being offered a very cheap EPC, you know, perhaps for a rental property, based on somebody guessing everything. We're just not doing it. We're just not doing it in a professional way yet.
I guess there's a related question there, about the skills that are available to do retrofitting, and having the skills base there and the people who are ready to roll.
Yes, and that's where PAS 2035 comes in, because they are talking about a skilled retrofit assessor. So it's retrofitting of an existing property, and it is a much more sophisticated approach to doing the energy audit. But I think the general concept is, Sarah, that we don't take this seriously. We aren't trying as a nation to have proper policies towards housing and energy efficiency, and it's not surprising, therefore, that we're doing so very little on it. It's a couple of years ago, but one of our local estate agents in Summertown, and I walked past, and they had their EPC information on it, and they had, you know, it's at the moment it's 60 points, and you could, by improvements, upgrade it. And every single one of the upgrades was 1 SAP point. And I thought, this can't be true. So I went in and asked the estate agent why they got an assessor who was giving such peculiar answers. And he said he'd take it away to his boss. And what happened? They stopped putting the recommendations up. They just took them out of the window. It's you know, I mean, nobody pretends that with an oven that you're going to be cooking a moist brick inside it. It's just a way of comparing, you know, one oven with another. And there's nothing wrong with the theory behind an EPC. If what you want to do is compare two properties on an identical basis, i.e. they're both perfectly warm, that gives you a lot of information. It's just we're not doing even that little bit properly.
Yeah. Andrew Warren, is the Housing Ministry interested in energy performance as part of their official remit?
Andrew, if you mean the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, I think there's a big question mark over that, which is probably why you're asking the question. And unfortunately, they are having to work with BEIS, who are more concerned about the energy side, and I'm not sure that they altogether work well. Sometimes it does, but we've just recently had a consultation on the privately rented sector and how to get privately rented homes up to a standard of C, and Bayes wants to have a register of landlords. And the Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government said they didn't want a register, they just want a database. I think the difference between a database and a register is that the register is compulsory and the database is slightly voluntary. And there's no way in which you can have a mandatory minimum standard of C in the privately rented sector if you don't know who the landlords are and therefore the efficiency of their properties. So I suspect, Andrew Warren, you know much more about this than me, but I'm not very convinced that those two aspects of government are working together well.
Andrew, would you like to come in on that yourself?
I'm in a position to do that now, I hope.
Excellent.
I am audible. No, I mean, I was asking a question which basically for the Latin scholars would have had a num after it. In other words, expecting the answer no. The Housing Ministry is not interested in the energy performance because it isn't part of their official remit. And the incident that Brenda just referred to is very, very typical. Wanting purely a database because you don't want actually anything that's properly enforced. It goes right back to, if you like, some of the worries that one had with Grenfell, which is that the reason why building regulations don't tend to work terribly well is very simply that the building control officer has actually no statutory right automatically to look at anything because an approved inspector can actually come in very easily and undertake the work. And as long as that approved inspector has appropriate initials after their name of a professional institute, then that will suffice. And that has meant that there has been very limited checking, as Brenda alluded to it. But unfortunately, how buildings are regulated is a decision entirely by the Housing, Communications and Local Government Ministry, which has no energy remit.
Which is a really shocking situation.
It does mean that whichever department, and we've had a series of them over the years that have had responsibility for energy efficiency, is working with one hand tied behind their back, because it is not their interest. I mean, I do not, of course, suggest for one moment that the Housing Ministry is run entirely for the benefit of the volume house builders. That would be quite inappropriate to make a suggestion. But the fact remains, though, that one of the reasons why we do not have zero carbon homes as an English policy, which we were expecting to have in 2016 at one point, is very simply because volume house builders decided they weren't going to do that and spoke words into the ear of the relevant cabinet minister, who actually, to be fair, at the time was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. But it is also what happens, I'm afraid, with too many housing ministers, that their interests are to do with numbers of homes rather than quality of homes, and equally the standards in the individual houses. But I think Brenda knows this perfectly well.
Yes, I mean, Sarah, what I would add to Andrew's wisdom is that all of this is becoming so much more important because of climate change. With 27 million homes, to improve at a faster rate than we've done over the last, I forget how many years, I had 20 years or so, to increase their energy efficiency at 30% faster. When we've done all the simple things like loft insulation and cavity wall insulation, or done most of them, and it's now much more difficult to improve some of the properties, and yet it's even more important that we do.
Daniel Scharf is pointing out that the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, their planning white paper does refer to carbon zero ready. and it is responsible for the Future Homes and Buildings Standard. You want to comment on that?
You ask comment, Brenda, or me?
Andrew, I've stopped commenting.
Right, we'll spare Brenda's voice. Yes,
I think the point. It is a very fair point. They are the only people who could be saying this, and this would have been issued as a government paper, and all white papers, have to be agreed by all departments of state. But the idea of moving to carbon zero ready, if you recall, the Prime Minister announced that we would do that by 2023 in his 10 environmental measures speech in November. And within minutes, we had the MHCOG altering that. I mean, this was well written up at the time, to 2025 when that would actually happen. Quite forgetting that we did originally have this scheduled for 2016, but this was basically because the volume house builders didn't want to start doing this too early. Obviously, Daniel is right that future homes and building standards have to be agreed with the housing ministry. My concern is that it's not deemed to be very important there to them. It's something which other parts of government have insisted they include in a government white paper like this, but it isn't something which one can observe is part of the sort of zeitgeist of that ministry.
Thank you. Yes. Brenda, we're coming to the end now, and to try and end on a more upbeat note, something that, as you know, quite a lot of us have got more interested in over the years, is the idea of multiple benefits. And that in policy terms, there may be a lot of mileage in bringing together the sort of benefits you get from better quality housing that is nicer to live in, that's more energy efficient, that creates employment, steady employment all over the country for people for the foreseeable future, building up and maintaining and adapting buildings and so on. There are all these things that can go together. Would you see that as a way to, a direction to be aiming for?
Oh, absolutely, Sarah, absolutely. and we do get discussions about green homes policies, etc., etc. The one thing I would say about that, and possibly I think there's a range of opinions within this audience, it's the extent to which a mandatory minimum standard, for instance, to get to C, should be a requirement on the building owner, regardless of whether there's any grants or not. Very largely, energy efficiency improvements in the existing housing stock, especially for owner-occupiers, has been dependent on grants. We haven't expected to do things unless we've been grant aided. Excuse me. I think, the Green Deal was good in as much as that was a requirement on us as owner-occupiers to do the work. It failed for all sorts of reasons, but it was actually getting us weaned off grants. And I think one of the issues we've got to tackle much more is the extent to which we believe that we have a remit as individuals to make energy efficiency important, and not just do it when the government will give us, or somebody will give us a bit of money to do it. So, just as Andrew was lambasting the Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government for not having a remit, a lot of us don't have the remit. So my hope is that with better labelling and better mandatory standards, we go out and do it.
Right. Many thanks, Brenda.